What if I told you that the most terrifying predator in the galaxy doesn't have razor-sharp claws, acid for blood, or the ability to phase through matter? What if the most feared species across 1,000 star systems is the one staring back at you in the mirror right now? Welcome back to another mind-bending story here on the channel. And if you're new here, you're about to discover why humans might just be the universe's biggest nightmare. Today, we're diving deep into a tale that'll make you question everything. You thought you knew about humanity's place in the cosmos. Picture this: every alien civilization out there, from the ancient ethereal councils to the militaristic void hunters, all share one common fear. Not black holes, not supernovas, not even the heat death of the universe itself. They fear us, they fear humanity, and the craziest part? We didn't even try to become the boogeyman of the galaxy. We just did what humans do best. We survived, we adapted, and we refused to quit when everyone else said it was impossible. But here's the thing that'll send chills down your spine. What makes us human, what we consider our greatest strengths, became the very reasons why entire galactic empires now whisper our name in the dark corners of space stations. Why mothers across 1 million worlds tell their children bedtime stories about the monsters from Sol 3. This isn't your typical alien invasion story where we're the underdogs fighting for survival. No, this is the story of how humanity accidentally became the thing that goes bump in the night for creatures that can manipulate time itself. We're talking about a complete role reversal that nobody saw coming, not even us. You see, when we first stepped into the galactic community, we were nothing more than curious bipeds who'd barely figured out how to leave their own solar system. The established civilizations looked at us the same way you'd look at a toddler trying to solve quantum physics. Amusing, harmless, maybe even a little cute in our naive ambition. They had empires spanning centuries, technology that seemed like magic, wisdom accumulated over millennia. What could these young humans possibly contribute to the cosmic order? But here's where it gets interesting, and I mean really interesting. Every single trait that made other species underestimate us, our short lifespans, our chaotic nature, our stubborn refusal to accept limitations, these weren't weaknesses. They were features, not bugs in the grand design of human evolution. And when the galaxy finally realized this truth, it was already too late. The story you're about to hear will show you how our greatest human qualities became the foundation of legends that still echo through the void. How our relentless curiosity became unstoppable expansion. How our emotional bonds became unbreakable alliances. How our creative problem-solving became tactical nightmares for our enemies. This is the story of how humanity went from galactic newcomers to the most feared force in known space. And trust me, you won't see the ending coming. So buckle up, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and turn on notifications, because stories like this are exactly why this channel exists. Let's dive into how humanity became the galaxy's nightmare. Innocente. The year was 2157, when humanity received its first official invitation to join what the galaxy called the confluence of civilized worlds. Captain Marcus Reed still remembers that day like it was yesterday, standing on the bridge of the exploration vessel Aurora as the massive alien construct materialized before them. It wasn't a ship in any sense humans understood, more like a living city that breathed starlight and hummed with energy that made their instruments go haywire. The beings that greeted them called themselves the Zenari, and they spoke with the casual authority of a species that had been mapping star systems when humans were still figuring out fire. They were tall, elegant creatures with crystalline skin that caught light in impossible ways, and they regarded humanity with the same polite interest you might show a particularly clever pet that had learned a new trick. "Welcome, young ones," their ambassador said, the words somehow translating directly into Reed's mind. "We have been observing your species for some time. Your rapid technological advancement is quite remarkable for such a primitive civilization. The way they said primitive wasn't meant to be insulting, it was just a statement of fact, like commenting on the weather. What happened next set the tone for humanity's introduction to galactic society. The Zanari offered to guide humanity into what they called proper civilization, complete with assigned territories, regulated technology transfers, and a carefully managed integration process that had worked successfully with dozens of other species over the millennia. They had it all figured out, a perfect system that had brought peace and order to the galaxy for thousands of years. Captain Reed listened politely, nodded at appropriate moments, and then asked a question that would later be remembered as the first crack in the foundation of galactic order. What if we don't want to be managed? The Zanari ambassador paused, their crystalline features shifting in what might have been confusion. The question didn't compute. Every species wanted to be lifted up, guided, civilized. That's how it had always worked. Within months, humanity had established its first permanent embassy in the galactic capital of Nexus Prime, a massive space station that housed representatives from over 300 different species. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was among the first human diplomats, and she quickly noticed something that would become a recurring theme. Nobody took humans seriously. At diplomatic functions, other species would pat her head like she was a child playing dress-up. In strategy meetings, human suggestions were politely dismissed before serious discussion began. When humanity requested access to certain star systems for colonization, they were offered small, resource-poor worlds that nobody else wanted, the galactic equivalent of being given the corner table at a restaurant. The established powers, the ethereal councils with their mastery over energy manipulation, the Hive Collective with their perfect unity of thought, the ancient vanguard with technology older than human civilization. They all agreed that humanity needed time to mature before they could handle real responsibility. It was adorable how eager these newcomers were, but someone had to protect them from the harsh realities of galactic politics. But even in those early days, there were warning signs that nobody paid attention to. Human colonists thrived on worlds that other species had written off as uninhabitable. Human traders found profitable routes through space that had been considered too dangerous for millennia. Human scientists asked questions about fundamental laws of physics that made ancient scholars uncomfortable because they didn't have good answers. The galaxy had seen newcomer species before, and they all followed the same pattern: initial enthusiasm followed by grateful acceptance of guidance, eventual integration into existing systems, and finally, comfortable compliance with the established order. Humanity would be no different. They couldn't be different. The system was too perfect, too well established, too logical to fail. That confidence would prove to be their first and greatest mistake. The first hint that humanity might not follow the usual pattern came from a mining colony on Kepler 442c, a world so hostile that even the resource-hungry collective had abandoned their extraction operations. The planet's surface was scoured by radiation storms, its atmosphere was poison, and temperatures swung between extremes that could flash-freeze water or melt steel within hours. It was, by every civilized standard, completely worthless. 3 months after establishing their mining outpost, humans weren't just surviving on Kepler 442c, they were thriving. Engineer David Chen had designed modular habitats that could actually move underground during radiation storms, using the planet's own geological instability as a power source. What the collective had seen as insurmountable obstacles, humans had turned into renewable energy systems. When the Galactic Mining Guild sent inspectors to see what was happening, they found humans extracting rare minerals at a rate that broke every existing efficiency record. More disturbing, they seemed to genuinely enjoy the challenge. Chen was grinning as he explained how they'd figured out how to predict the radiation storms by listening to the planet's magnetic field fluctuations. To him, it was just another puzzle to solve. The inspectors filed their report with growing unease. This wasn't supposed to happen. Advanced civilizations had laws about what environments could support intelligent life, and Kepler 442c violated all of them. Yet here were humans, not just surviving but innovating in ways that made million-year-old extraction techniques look primitive. Similar reports started flooding in from across human-occupied space. On the water world of Aquatica 7, where the pressure should have crushed any surface dweller, humans had built floating cities that rode out tsunamis like they were gentle waves. Marine biologist Dr. Rachel Torres had somehow convinced the planet's predatory sea creatures to become part of their ecosystem rather than threats to be eliminated. The ethereal councils, masters of energy manipulation for over 50,000 years, were baffled when human physicist Dr. James Parker figured out how to create stable plasma fields using what he called controlled chaos theory. Parker's methods shouldn't have worked according to established science, but they were 30% more efficient than traditional techniques and required a fraction of the energy input. But it wasn't just their technical innovations that made other species uncomfortable. It was their attitude. Every other civilized race approached problems with careful analysis, extensive planning, and systematic implementation of proven solutions. Humans just dove in headfirst and figured it out as they went along. They called it learning by doing, and it was absolutely terrifying to watch. Captain Elena Vasquez became something of a legend when she successfully navigated the Maelstrom Nebula, a region of space so chaotic that even the ancient vanguards, most sophisticated computers, couldn't chart a safe passage. Instead of relying on calculations and probability matrices, Vasquez flew by instinct, reading the energy patterns like an artist reading brushstrokes. She emerged from the other side of the nebula with a new trade route that cut travel time between two major sectors by 40%. When asked to explain her method, Vasquez just shrugged and said, "I listened to what the nebula was telling me." The Vanguard's navigation specialists spent months trying to understand what she meant, but their analysis equipment couldn't detect whatever signals Vasquez had been following. They were learning that humans operated on principles that didn't appear in any textbook. Perhaps most unsettling was how quickly humans learned and adapted. Species that had mastered their crafts over millennia watched in growing alarm as humans absorbed their knowledge in decades, then started improving on techniques that had been considered perfected. It wasn't supposed to work that way. There were supposed to be natural limits, evolutionary barriers, fundamental constraints that kept the galactic order stable. But humans seemed to treat limitations as suggestions rather than laws. They didn't ask permission to innovate. They just did it and asked for forgiveness later. And somehow, impossibly, it kept working. The galaxy was starting to realize that they hadn't welcomed a new junior partner into their civilized community. They had invited something unprecedented, unpredictable, and potentially unstoppable into their perfectly ordered world. The moment everything changed happened in a system that most civilized species had forgotten existed. The Arcturus incident, as historians would later call it, began as a routine territorial dispute between the hegemony of Talvar and the Crystal, alliance over mining rights to a cluster of asteroid-rich moons. It was exactly the kind of conflict that the confluence usually resolved through careful mediation, economic incentives, and diplomatic pressure. Standard procedure for maintaining galactic peace. What nobody expected was for humanity to get involved. The human colony ship New Horizon had been traveling through the disputed system when the conflict erupted. Captain Lisa Rodriguez found herself caught between two massive battle fleets, each one capable of reducing her single vessel to space dust without breaking formation. Standard protocol would have been to retreat, call for confluence peacekeepers, and wait for the proper authorities to sort things out. That's what any civilized species would have done. Instead, Rodriguez did something that made both alien fleets pause their bombardment just to stare in disbelief. She flew her unarmed colony, shipped directly between the two battle lines, and opened a general communication channel that every ship in the system could hear. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the human vessel New Horizon. I've got 3,000 colonists aboard this ship, including 500 children who are scared out of their minds right now. I don't know what you're fighting about, and frankly, I don't care. But I'm not moving my ship until you both stand down and work this out like civilized beings." The silence that followed lasted exactly 17 seconds, long enough for both fleet commanders to process what they had just heard. A single human ship, completely outgunned and outnumbered, had just inserted itself into a conflict between two of the galaxy's most powerful military forces and demanded they stop fighting. Admiral Kethvar of the Talvar hegemony was the first to respond, his translated voice crackling with indignation. "Human vessel, you will withdraw immediately or be fired upon. This is not your concern." Rodriguez's reply would be quoted in military academies for generations. "Admiral, with all due respect, you just made it my concern when you started shooting while my people were in the neighborhood. Now we can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, nobody fires another shot until we talk." What happened next defied every principle of space warfare that had been established over millions of years of galactic civilization. Rodriguez didn't just position her ship between the fleets. She somehow convinced both sides to send representatives aboard the New Horizon for negotiations. Not to a neutral station, not to Confluence headquarters, but to a human colony ship where the meeting room smelled like recycled air and coffee. The negotiations lasted 18 hours, during which Rodriguez served as mediator between species that had been enemies for centuries. She had no diplomatic training, no knowledge of their historical grievances, and no authority to broker any kind of agreement. What she did have was something the galaxy had never encountered in conflict resolution: complete, fearless honesty, combined with an absolute refusal to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. By the time the talks ended, both fleets had agreed to joint mining operations under human oversight, with profits split equally between the three species. It was an arrangement so unprecedented that the Confluence Council spent weeks trying to figure out if it was even legal under existing galactic law. But the real shock came when intelligence reports revealed how Rodriguez had convinced two militaristic species to abandon their territorial dispute. She hadn't used advanced diplomatic protocols or economic leverage or political pressure. She had simply asked each side to explain their position, then pointed out that they were both fighting over resources that would be exhausted within 50 years, while ignoring opportunities for mutual benefit that could last for centuries. More importantly, she had made both sides realize that their ancient hatred was costing them more than the resources they were fighting over. It was problem-solving on a level that made traditional diplomacy look like elaborate theater. The Arcturus incident sent shockwaves through every major power in the galaxy. If a single human with no training could resolve a conflict that had stumped professional mediators for decades, what did that say about the effectiveness of their carefully structured civilization? What did it say about the assumptions they had made about proper order and authority? The answer was becoming uncomfortably clear. Humans didn't just think differently, they operated by completely different rules. Rules that seemed to work better than the systems that had maintained galactic peace for millennia, and that realization was the beginning of something that would reshape the balance of power across the entire galaxy. News of the Arcturus incident spread through galactic communication networks faster than any previous diplomatic event in recorded history. Within weeks, every major civilization from the core worlds to the outer rim had received detailed reports of how a single human had accomplished what their most skilled negotiators had failed to achieve in decades of careful diplomacy. The initial response was skeptical dismissal. The ethereal councils released a statement calling it an unfortunate anomaly that in no way reflects the established principles of proper civilization. The Hive Collective's governing minds declared it irrelevant data that does not affect optimal societal function. The ancient vanguard, with their typical millennia-spanning perspective, simply noted that primitive species occasionally stumble upon effective solutions through random chance. But then more reports started coming in, and they painted a picture that made the established powers increasingly uncomfortable. The human agricultural colony on Demeter Thorv had somehow convinced the planet's carnivorous plant life to become part of their farming ecosystem instead of a threat to be eliminated. Xenobotanist Dr. Amanda Price had approached the problem by asking a question that had never occurred to previous colonists. What if the plants weren't trying to be hostile, but were just protecting their territory? Within 6 months, human farms were producing food yields that exceeded anything achieved by traditional terraforming techniques. On the industrial world of Foundry Prime, human engineers had solved a manufacturing problem that had plagued the mechanoid assembly for over 2,000 years. Instead of trying to perfect their precision machinery, Chief Engineer Robert Stone had introduced something he called controlled variability into the production process. The results were products with a slight randomness that actually made them more durable and adaptable than their perfectly uniform predecessors. Each individual incident could have been explained away as luck or coincidence, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Humans weren't just succeeding in isolated cases, they were consistently finding solutions that no one else had even considered possible. The galactic intelligence networks began paying much closer attention to human activities, and what they discovered was deeply unsettling. Human colonies weren't just surviving in hostile environments, they were transforming them. Human traders weren't just finding new routes through dangerous space, they were making those routes safer for everyone who followed. Human researchers weren't just advancing their own technology, they were asking questions that forced other species to reconsider fundamental assumptions about reality itself. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a human quantum physicist working on the research station at Proxima Central, had published a paper suggesting that the established laws of physics might be more like guidelines that could be bent under certain conditions. The paper was initially dismissed by the scientific consortium as primitive speculation, but when Tanaka demonstrated a working prototype of faster-than-light communication that violated several supposed universal constants, the scientific community was forced to take notice. The communication device, which Tanaka had built in her spare time using materials from the station's recycling center, achieved instantaneous information transfer across galactic distances. Technology that the ancient vanguard had declared theoretically impossible was now sitting on a workbench, held together with what appeared to be repurposed coffee machine parts and sheer human stubbornness. But it wasn't just their technical achievements that were causing concern, it was their rate of expansion and adaptation. Human colonies were appearing in star systems that had been considered uninhabitable. Human ships were traveling through space lanes that had been marked as permanently hazardous, and human influence was spreading through the galaxy's political and economic networks with unprecedented speed. The Confluence Council called an emergency session to address what they were now privately referring to as the human problem. For the first time in their recorded history, the galaxy's governing body was genuinely worried about the actions of a single species. Not because humans were aggressive or expansionist in the traditional sense, but because they were making everyone else's carefully maintained systems look obsolete. Species that had dominated their sectors for millennia were finding themselves outcompeted by humans who had been in space for less than a century. Trade routes that had been stable for thousands of years were being disrupted by human merchants who somehow found more efficient paths through space. Diplomatic relationships that had been carefully balanced for generations were being destabilized by human mediators who solved problems by ignoring established protocols. The most disturbing reports came from the frontier worlds, where human influence was strongest. Entire systems were beginning to adopt human methods of problem-solving, human approaches to technology, and human attitudes toward established authority. It was like watching a virus spread through the galaxy's civilized order. Except this virus made everything it touched more efficient, more adaptable, and more independent. The ancient vanguard, who had maintained stability through careful control and gradual change for over 1 million years, faced something they had never encountered before. A force of change that moved too fast to contain and was too effective to dismiss. Humanity had become something unprecedented in galactic history, not conquerors or destroyers, but transformers. And transformation, they were beginning to realize, could be far more dangerous than any weapon. The event that historians would later call the Terra Nova Crisis began as what should have been humanity's greatest disaster. A massive stellar storm had engulfed the Kepler 438 system, trapping 17 different species on the mining world of Terra Nova with no hope of evacuation. The electromagnetic radiation had knocked out all long-range communication. The spatial distortions made faster-than-light travel impossible, and the planet's failing atmospheric processes meant everyone would be dead within weeks. It was exactly the kind of crisis that the galaxy's emergency response protocols had been designed to handle. The Confluence Rescue Authority immediately dispatched their most advanced ships. The ethereal councils prepared their energy manipulation specialists, and the mechanoid assembly readied their most sophisticated life support equipment. Everyone agreed that it would take the combined resources of multiple civilizations to mount a successful rescue operation. But by the time the rescue fleets arrived 3 weeks later, they found something that changed everything they thought. They knew about crisis management, resource allocation, and the fundamental nature of civilized response to catastrophe. The humans hadn't waited to be rescued. They had organized the entire planet. Commander Sarah Martinez, the senior human official on Terra Nova, had done something that violated every principle of proper emergency management. Instead of establishing strict rationing protocols and maintaining species separation to prevent conflicts, she had convinced all 17 species to pool their resources and expertise into a single survival effort. The Zalathi, master engineers who normally worked exclusively with their own kind, were collaborating with human mechanics to jury-rig the atmospheric processes using parts salvaged from mining equipment. The crystalline HFY, who communicated through harmonic frequencies that most species found painful, had learned to work with human acoustics specialists to create a planet-wide communication network using the mine shafts as resonance chambers. Most shocking of all, the insectoid hive collective drones, who had never operated independently from their governing minds, were making individual decisions and showing initiative under human guidance. Martinez had somehow convinced them that survival required thinking for themselves, at least temporarily. When the rescue fleets finally established contact, Martinez's first transmission wasn't a plea for help or a status report on casualties. It was a polite inquiry about whether the rescue ships needed any assistance, since the planet's population had not only survived, but had actually improved their living conditions beyond pre-crisis levels. The rescue coordinators demanded a full briefing, expecting to find a barely functional emergency government holding together through strict rationing and martial law. Instead, they discovered that Martinez had established something unprecedented in galactic emergency management. A functioning multi-species democracy that had solved problems through cooperative innovation rather than authoritarian control. The atmospheric processes weren't just repaired, they had been redesigned to be more efficient than the original systems. The mining operations hadn't been shut down to conserve resources. They had been optimized to extract exactly the materials needed for survival improvements. The different species weren't being kept separate to prevent conflict. They were working together on joint projects that leveraged each group's unique strengths. When asked how she had accomplished what experienced crisis managers considered impossible, Martinez gave an answer that would be studied in leadership academies for centuries. "I asked everyone what they were good at, then figured out how to let them do it. Turns out when people aren't scared of being told they're doing it wrong, they come up with amazing solutions." But the real revelation came when the rescue coordinators realized that Martinez wasn't trained in emergency management, multi-species psychology, or crisis leadership. She was a mining surveyor who had been on Terra Nova to map mineral deposits. Her qualifications for managing a planetary crisis consisted of 2 years of college engineering courses and what she called common sense about people. The reports that reached the Confluence Council were unprecedented in their implications. An untrained human had not only prevented what should have been a catastrophic loss of life, but had created a functioning society that multiple species now wanted to use as a model for their own crisis management protocols. More disturbing was the realization that Martinez hadn't used any advanced technology, sophisticated psychological manipulation, or established governmental authority to achieve these results. She had simply treated every being on the planet as intelligent individuals capable of contributing to solutions, regardless of their species, rank, or traditional social role. The Terra Nova crisis marked the moment when the galaxy's leadership realized that humanity wasn't just different. They were operating by principles that made traditional authority structures look arbitrary and inefficient. Martinez had achieved better results by ignoring established protocols than experienced professionals had achieved by following them. For the first time in galactic history, the Confluence Council faced the possibility that their carefully maintained system of civilization might not be the optimal way to organize intelligent life. And if their system wasn't optimal, if there were better ways to solve problems and manage society, then what did that say about the legitimacy of their authority? The answer was becoming clear, and it terrified them more than any external threat they had ever faced. Humanity had become living proof that there were alternatives to the established order, alternatives that worked better than systems that had maintained stability for millennia. The galaxy's nightmare wasn't that humans would conquer them through force. It was that humans would make their entire civilization look obsolete through simple competence. In the months following Terra Nova, the galaxy began experiencing something it hadn't seen in over 50,000 years. Voluntary systemic change on a massive scale. Species that had maintained the same governmental structures, the same technological approaches, and the same social hierarchies for millennia were suddenly questioning whether their traditional methods were actually the best ways to organize civilized life. The Zalathi Engineering Collective, renowned throughout the galaxy for their rigid adherence to proven construction techniques, shocked everyone by establishing what they called experimental development teams that were encouraged to try untested approaches to problem solving. Within a year, They had revolutionized spacecraft design by incorporating what their chief engineer openly called human-inspired creative chaos into their development process. The results were ships that were not only more efficient, but more adaptable to unexpected situations. When asked to explain this dramatic departure from traditional methods, senior engineer Kaltvesh made a statement that sent ripples through industrial centers across the galaxy. We realized that perfection is less useful than adaptability. Humans taught us that the best solution is not always the most elegant one. Even more significant was the response from younger members of established species. The ethereal councils, which had maintained their authority through millennia of carefully controlled knowledge transfer, began facing something unprecedented: their own youth questioning the necessity of traditional hierarchical learning structures. Young ethereals, who had observed human educational methods, were asking why they needed to spend centuries mastering established techniques before being allowed to experiment with new approaches. They pointed to human students who were making breakthrough discoveries within years of beginning their studies, not because they were more intelligent, but because they weren't constrained by the assumption that innovation required perfect mastery of existing knowledge. The Hive Collective experienced perhaps the most dramatic changes. Drones that had worked alongside humans during the Terra Nova crisis returned to their home worlds with something that had never existed in their species: history, individual initiative. They began making decisions without consulting the governing minds, not out of rebellion, but because they had learned that faster decision-making often produced better results. The governing minds initially tried to suppress this development, but they faced an unexpected problem. The independent thinking drones were actually more effective at their assigned tasks. Productivity increased, problem-solving improved, and innovation accelerated beyond anything the collective had achieved through perfect unity of thought. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a human sociologist who had been studying these changes, published a paper titled "The Cascade Effect: How Questioning Authority Becomes Questioning Everything." Her research showed that exposure to human methods didn't just change how species approached specific problems, it changed how they thought about thinking itself. Warren's most significant finding was that the species showing the most dramatic, positive changes were those that had embraced what she called constructive questioning, the human tendency to ask not just "how do we do this," but "why do we do this way? And what if we tried something completely different?" This shift in thinking was having effects far beyond technology and governance. The galaxy's entire economic structure was evolving as species began to realize that competition and cooperation weren't mutually exclusive concepts. Human-influenced trade networks were demonstrating that helping competitors succeed often led to greater profits for everyone involved. The ancient vanguard, with their million-year perspective on galactic civilization, faced perhaps the most profound challenge to their worldview. They had always assumed that their longevity gave them inherent wisdom that shorter-lived species couldn't match. But humans were achieving in decades what the vanguard had accomplished over centuries, not through superior intelligence, but through willingness to accept failure as part of the learning process. Vanguard curator Zenthmal, in a statement that shocked the galactic community, admitted, "We have confused the accumulation of time with the acquisition of wisdom. Humans have shown us that true learning comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from making them quickly and learning from them faster." But perhaps the most significant change was in how species viewed authority itself. The galaxy's traditional power structures had been based on the assumption that civilization required careful management by established authorities who understood proper order better than individual citizens. Humans had demonstrated that distributed decision-making often produced better results than centralized control. This realization was spreading through the galaxy like wildfire as species began to understand that the choice between chaos and order was a false dilemma. Humans had shown that there was a third option, structured flexibility that allowed for rapid adaptation while maintaining social cohesion. The Confluence Council found itself in the unprecedented position of governing a galaxy that was voluntarily restructuring itself. For the first time in their existence, they were managing change rather than preventing it, and they were discovering that their traditional tools of control were not only unnecessary but actually counterproductive. The galaxy's nightmare had become reality. Humanity had made their entire system of civilization look not evil or wrong, but simply outdated, and there was no defense against being made obsolete by simple competence and better ideas. And there you have it, the story of how humanity accidentally became the galaxy's most feared species, not through conquest or destruction, but through something far more terrifying, proving that there were better ways to do almost everything the established civilizations had been doing for millennia. Think about it for a moment. The galaxy's greatest nightmare wasn't an invasion fleet or a planet-killing weapon. It was the realization that their perfectly ordered civilization could be improved by a species that had barely figured out interstellar travel. Humans didn't destroy the existing order. They made it irrelevant through simple competence and stubborn refusal to accept that this is how it's always been done was a good enough reason to stop trying to do better. What makes this story so compelling, and honestly so human, is that we never set out to revolutionize galactic civilization. We just did what humans have always done. We saw problems and tried to solve them. We encountered obstacles and found ways around them. And we refused to accept limitations that didn't make sense to us. Our greatest weapon wasn't technology or strategy. It was asking the question, why not, when everyone else had accepted that's impossible. The real genius of humanity in this story isn't our intelligence or our adaptability, though those certainly played a part. It's our fundamental belief that things can always be better, that there's always room for improvement, and that the best ideas can come from anyone, regardless of their training, their rank, or their species. The established galactic powers had built their entire civilization on the assumption that stability required careful control, that innovation was dangerous, and that change should happen slowly under expert guidance. Humans proved that rapid innovation, distributed decision-making, and embrace of calculated risks could produce better results than millennia of careful planning. But here's what I find most fascinating about this tale. The galaxy's fear of humanity wasn't really about humans at all. It was about what humanity represented, the possibility that everything they had built, everything they had assumed was necessary for civilization, might not be the best way forward. We became their nightmare because we were living proof that there were alternatives to their established order. So I want to ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. What is it about human nature that makes us natural disruptors of established systems? Is it our short lifespans that make us impatient with slow change? Our emotional nature that makes us question purely logical solutions? Our stubborn individualism that resists accepting authority without question? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know what you think makes humanity unique in the universe. Are we natural revolutionaries, or are we just too stubborn to know when we're supposed to give up? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into human exceptionalism in space, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more mind-bending science fiction stories that'll make you see humanity in a whole new light. Coming up next week, we're exploring what happens when humans discover that the universe's greatest mystery isn't what's out there in the cosmos, but what's been hiding inside human DNA all along. Until then, remember that sometimes the most powerful Force in the universe isn't the ability to destroy, it's the ability to imagine that things could be better, and the stubborn refusal to accept that they can't be. That's pure human spirit right there, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what the galaxy needed, even if they were too scared to admit it. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the stars, and I'll see you in the next one.